Louisiana, 1943. Rain drummed against the tin roof of the camp chapel, a sound like distant artillery that made the German prisoners flinch. Inside, beneath exposed wooden beams, Father Michael O'Brien stood at the altar in his army chaplain's uniform, preparing for Sunday Mass. 23 German prisoners sat in makeshift pews, their faces showing confusion that bordered on shock. They had been told America was a Protestant wasteland, a godless place of materialism and moral decay. Yet here stood a priest, speaking Latin, blessing the host, and the cognitive dissonance was physically painful to witness. Camp Claiborne sprawled across the pine forests of central Louisiana like a temporary city built for war. Rows of wooden barracks stretched between the trees, connected by muddy roads that turned into streams when the rain came. Guard towers rose at intervals, their searchlights cutting through the humid darkness each night. The wire fencing looked almost decorative against the dense vegetation, as if the forest itself provided better containment than any human construction. The German prisoners arrived in late summer, when the heat pressed down like something solid and the air felt too thick to breathe properly. They came in trucks from the docks at New Orleans, still wearing the uniforms they had been captured in across North Africa. Dust from the desert still clung to their boots. Sand had worked its way into the seams of their clothing, a physical reminder of how far they had traveled from the war. Klaus Richter stood with the others in the processing line, watching American soldiers move through bureaucratic routines with practiced efficiency. He was 24, captured near Tunis, after his unit had run out of ammunition and options simultaneously. The propaganda had prepared him for brutality, for savage treatment by an enemy incapable of civilization. Instead, he found paperwork, medical examinations, questions asked through interpreters who spoke textbook German with American accents. The camp chaplain appeared during processing, moving through the lines with a quiet presence that drew attention despite making no demands for it. He wore an army uniform with a cross insignia on the collar. A priest, Klaus realized with surprise. But this was strange already. The propaganda had emphasized America's Protestant nature, its rejection of traditional authority. The presence of a military chaplain complicated that narrative in ways Klaus could not immediately process. Father Michael O'Brien was 42, born in Boston to Irish immigrants who had brought their faith across the ocean like precious cargo. He had joined the Army Chaplain Corps in 1942, driven by a conviction that men at war needed spiritual guidance more than they needed another rifle. He spoke no German. His Latin was adequate. His faith was absolute. And he approached his duties with the same matter-of-fact competence that characterized the best military chaplains, believing deeply while remaining practically focused on immediate needs. He stopped at Klaus's position in line. Their eyes met. Father O'Brien nodded, a gesture that communicated something Klaus could not name. Recognition, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that they would be sharing this space, this time, whatever came next. The chapel had been built quickly, like everything else in the camp. Wood framing, tin roof, screen windows that let in mosquitoes, and a constant humidity. Rough wooden benches served as pews. A simple altar stood at the front, covered with white cloth. A crucifix hung on the wall behind it, carved by someone with more devotion than artistic skill. It was not beautiful, but it was sacred space, and that mattered more than aesthetics. Father O'Brien had announced that Catholic prisoners could attend Mass on Sunday mornings. The announcement came through interpreters, posted on the bulletin boards near the mess hall. Optional attendance. No pressure. Just an offer extended to those who wished to practice their faith. Klaus had been raised Catholic in a small Bavarian village where the church bells marked time, and the priest knew everyone's sins before confession. But the regime had complicated religious practice, making it suspect, politically dangerous. Many had stopped attending. Others went through motions emptied of meaning. Klaus had tried to maintain his faith but war and propaganda had eroded it like water wearing away stone. Still, Sunday morning found him walking to the chapel, partly from curiosity, partly from habit, mostly from a hunger he did not fully understand, a need for something familiar in this alien place where everything from the climate to the language felt hostile. 30 other German prisoners were already there, sitting on benches, waiting in silence. Some looked defiant, as if attending Mass was an act of resistance against their captivity. Others appeared merely confused. A few had their eyes closed, perhaps praying, perhaps just trying to make sense of their situation. Father O'Brien entered through a side door. He wore vestments over his uniform white alb, green chasuble appropriate for ordinary time. He moved to the altar with practiced efficiency, arranging the chalice, the paten, the missal. Then he turned to face them. In nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The Latin hit Klaus like a physical force. The same words, the same ritual, the same ancient liturgy that transcended borders and wars and all the things that divided men into enemies. His hands moved automatically, making the sign of the cross. Around him, other prisoners did the same, their movements synchronized by years of practice that propaganda had not erased. The Mass proceeded with a timeless rhythm that had survived empires and plagues and wars more devastating than this one. Father O'Brien's Latin was American accented but correct. The prayers followed the proper order. The responses came naturally, the German prisoners murmuring in Latin, alongside their American captors who had also attended, sitting in the back rows, praying in the same language, despite fighting in different armies. During the homily, Father O'Brien spoke in English. An interpreter stood beside him, translating sentences into German with careful precision. The message was simple. God's love transcended human divisions. All men were brothers in Christ. War was a human failure, not a divine mandate. These were not radical ideas. They were fundamental Christian teaching. But hearing them from an American priest in a prison camp while wearing enemy uniforms, the context transformed platitudes into something that felt dangerous. Klaus listened with his jaw clenched. Part of him wanted to reject this, to maintain the clarity of us versus them that war required. But another part, older and deeper, recognized truth when it heard it. The cognitive dissonance was painful. America was supposed to be godless. Americans were supposed to lack moral foundation. Yet here stood a priest, offering the same sacraments, teaching the same doctrines, embodying the same faith. When communion came, Father O'Brien offered it to all present, prisoners and guards alike. Klaus stood in line with the others, moving forward slowly, aware of how strange this was. Receiving the Eucharist from an enemy, kneeling at an altar built by captors, accepting the body and blood of Christ from hands that served the army fighting against his homeland. The host touched his tongue. He closed his eyes, tasted the thin wafer that dissolved immediately, but somehow filled an emptiness he had been carrying since North Africa. Since before that, really. Since the war began and faith became complicated by politics and propaganda. He returned to his seat, knelt, tried to pray, but found only confusion. The Mass ended. Father O'Brien blessed them. They filed out into the Louisiana heat, blinking in sunlight that felt obscene after the chapel's dim interior. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Sunday Mass drew regular attendees. Some came weekly, others sporadically. A core group of about 20 prisoners attended consistently, drawn by faith or habit, or simply the routine of something familiar. Father O'Brien began staying after Mass, available for conversation. His German was non-existent, but one of the American guards, a young man named Mueller, whose grandparents had immigrated from Dusseldorf, served as informal interpreter. The conversations were halting, imperfect, conducted through translation that sometimes mangled meaning. But communication happened nonetheless. Klaus found himself among those who stayed. Not every week, but often enough that Father O'Brien began to recognize him, nodding when they made eye contact. One Sunday, after the others had left, Klaus approached with Müller, trailing to translate. "Father, I have a question." His voice came out rougher than intended. "Of course." Father O'Brien gestured to a bench. They sat. Klaus struggled to articulate what he needed to ask. Finally, simply, "How can you be a priest and a soldier?" Müller translated. Father O'Brien nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this question. "The Church teaches that there are just wars," he said, pausing for translation. "Wars fought in defense of the innocent. My role is not to fight, but to provide spiritual care for those who do. Soldiers need God, perhaps more than anyone. But you serve an army fighting against other Christians." Father O'Brien's expression grew somber. "Yes, that is the tragedy of this war. That Christians fight Christians. But evil must be opposed. The regime you served," he paused, choosing words carefully, "it has done terrible things. Things that violate everything Christ taught." Klaus wanted to argue, to defend, but the defense would not come. He had seen things, heard things, orders that made no sense unless you accepted premises he no longer believed. The propaganda had been so complete, so encompassing, that questioning it felt like betraying everything. But sitting here, in this rough chapel, across from a priest who served the enemy yet offered the same sacraments, the propaganda's hold was weakening. "I do not know what I believe anymore," Klaus said quietly. Müller translated, his voice carrying the same uncertainty. Father O'Brien leaned forward. "That is honest. Honesty is where faith begins." Another prisoner, a man named Friedrich, had carried his rosary through the entire war. He kept it hidden in his boot, the beads worn smooth by years of prayer. The regime discouraged such displays. Religious devotion marked you as potentially disloyal. But Friedrich had persisted, praying in secret, maintaining his connection to God despite the pressures to abandon it. In the camp, he could pray openly. This realization came slowly, almost suspiciously. No one cared if prisoners prayed. No one monitored their religious practices or reported devotion as suspicious behavior. The freedom was disorienting. He had grown so accustomed to hiding his faith that practicing it openly felt like a trap. One evening, sitting outside the barracks as the sun set and the mosquitoes emerged, Friedrich took out his rosary. He began the prayers quietly, moving through the decades with practiced rhythm. Several other prisoners noticed. A few looked uncomfortable. Others ignored him. But one, a young man named Peter, approached. "May I pray with you?" Friedrich nodded. Peter sat. They prayed together, their voices low but audible, murmuring Hail Marys in German, while American guards passed by without comment. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary act, yet it felt revolutionary, dangerous, proof that something fundamental had shifted. Over the following weeks, others joined. 5 prisoners, then 10. They gathered after evening meals, forming a small group that prayed the rosary together. Father O'Brien learned about this and provided a second rosary, a gift that seemed to carry more meaning than the simple string of beads warranted. He also taught them prayers in English, slowly expanding their vocabulary beyond military terms and camp regulations. Klaus watched this development with mixed feelings. Part of him envied their certainty, their ability to maintain faith despite everything. But another part remained locked in confusion, unable to reconcile what he had been taught with what he was experiencing. Father O'Brien offered the sacrament of reconciliation on Saturday afternoons. He set up a simple screen in the chapel's corner, creating minimal privacy. The invitation was extended to all Catholic prisoners. No pressure, no judgment. Just an offer made available for those who felt the need. Klaus avoided confession for weeks. He was not ready, did not know what to confess. did not understand how to reconcile his actions as a soldier with his faith as a Christian. The two seemed irreconcilable, separated by a gap too wide to bridge. But the weight grew heavier. The internal contradiction pressed down with increasing force until, one Saturday in October, when the Louisiana heat had finally broken into something approaching autumn, Klaus found himself walking to the chapel. Father O'Brien sat waiting. The chapel was empty except for them. Klaus knelt at the screen. The wood was rough against his knees. He could see Father O'Brien's profile through the mesh, indistinct but present. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The words came in German. Mueller was not there to translate. But Father O'Brien understood the ritual form, the intention even if not the specific language. He made the sign of the cross and spoke the Latin blessing, words that transcended linguistic barriers. Klaus began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency. He confessed doubt, anger, the ways he had compromised his faith for political convenience, the orders he had followed while knowing, on some level, that they violated everything he claimed to believe, the ease with which he had accepted propaganda that contradicted gospel teachings. He spoke in German. Father O'Brien understood perhaps one word in 10, but confession is not about perfect communication. It is about unburdening, about speaking truth into the presence of God, with a priest serving as witness and conduit for divine mercy. When Klaus finished, when the words finally stopped coming, silence filled the chapel. Then Father O'Brien spoke. In Latin, the words of absolution, "Ego te absolvo peccatis tuis, in nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti." Klaus felt something break open in his chest. Not relief exactly. Not forgiveness, he could articulate. Just a lessening of weight. A small space opening where before there had been only compression. He emerged from the chapel into afternoon light that seemed different somehow, clearer, or perhaps he was seeing it differently. Friedrich stood near the entrance, rosary in his hand, waiting his turn. They made eye contact. Friedrich nodded. Klaus nodded back. No words were necessary. The camp allowed prisoners to send letters, censored and limited, but permitted. Klaus wrote to his mother in Bavaria. He told her about the heat, the food, which was adequate, the work assignments in the camp motor pool where he helped maintain vehicles. He did not mention the chapel, did not describe Father O'Brien, or the Mass, or the confession that had cracked something open inside him. But his mother was perceptive. Her response, arriving 6 weeks later after passing through multiple layers of military censorship, asked careful questions. Was he able to attend Mass? Were there opportunities for prayer? The questions were coded, cautious, aware that letters might be read by authorities on both sides. Klaus wrote back, equally careful. Yes, there were religious services. Yes, he had attended. The specifics remained vague, but his mother would understand the subtext. He was maintaining his faith, perhaps even rediscovering it. Other prisoners wrote similar letters. Friedrich mentioned the rosary group. Peter described attending confession for the first time in years. These small details, scattered across dozens of letters sent to addresses in Germany, carried weight beyond their brevity. They were evidence that faith persisted, that the regime's attempts to subsume religion under political ideology had not fully succeeded. Father O'Brien learned about these letters through Mueller, who sometimes helped prisoners compose them in English before translating back to German. The chaplain was pleased but cautious. He understood the political implications. The regime had complicated relationship with religious institutions. Prisoners returning to Germany with reinforced faith might face difficulties, but that was a future problem. His job was present pastoral care, not political calculation. As winter approached, winter being a relative term in Louisiana, where the temperature merely became comfortable rather than oppressive, Father O'Brien announced plans for Christmas services. Mass at midnight on Christmas Eve, carol singing, Decorations for the chapel. He invited prisoners to participate in preparations. The response surprised him. 15 prisoners volunteered. They carved additional decorations for the chapel, built a nativity scene from scrap wood, practiced hymns in both German and Latin. The activity had a purpose beyond religious observation. It created normalcy, routine, a sense that life continued even in an imprisonment, that holy days still mattered, that some things transcended war. Klaus found himself carving wooden figures for the nativity. He had no particular skill, but the work was meditative, focusing on details, the curve of Mary's veil, the proportions of Joseph's staff, the simple forms of shepherds and sheep created space where thoughts could settle, where the constant internal argument between propaganda and experience could quiet momentarily. An American soldier, a corporal named Stevens, who was also Catholic, provided paint. Blues and reds and gold for halos. The colors were garish, inappropriate for the rough wood, but they added something. Joy, maybe, or just brightness in the gray monotony of camp life. Friedrich led the carol practice. He had a good voice, trained in church choirs before the war. Under his direction, the prisoners learned English versions of familiar hymns. Silent Night, they already knew Still Nacht, originally German, now sung in the enemy's language. Oh, Come All the Faithful required more practice. The Latin Adest Fidelis came easier, familiar from Mass. Father O'Brien attended these practice sessions, listening from the back of the chapel. He did not interfere, did not offer criticism, just presence, steady and affirming. Klaus noticed that the chaplain often had his eyes closed during singing, as if absorbing something beyond the music itself. The night arrived cold by Louisiana standards. Temperatures in the 40s, enough to make breath visible and require jackets. The chapel had no heating system. Father O'Brien brought in kerosene heaters borrowed from the camp quartermaster. They warmed the space inadequately, but symbolically. Midnight Mass drew the largest attendance yet. 40 German prisoners filled the benches. American soldiers occupied the back rows guards officially, but also worshippers. The distinction had blurred. Enemy and captor merged into congregation, unified by liturgy older than any of their conflicts. The chapel glowed with candlelight. Someone had strung evergreen branches across the rafters, filling the air with pine scent that almost masked the kerosene smell. The nativity scene occupied a place of honor beside the altar, its rough wooden figures painted in bright, childlike colors. Father O'Brien processed in wearing white vestments. The Mass began with Adest Fidelis, sung in Latin by German and American voices together. The harmonies were imperfect, but the intention was complete. Klaus sang, his voice merging with others, creating something larger than individual sound. The gospel reading told the familiar story. Angels announcing good news to shepherds. A Savior born in poverty and humility. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Here they were, gathered in worship while their respective nations fought a war that had already destroyed millions. Peace on earth remained aspirational. Father O'Brien's homily was brief. He spoke about how Christ came not to the powerful but to the poor, not to palaces but to a stable, not to those who had everything figured out, but to those who were lost and seeking. Mueller translated with unusual care, aware that every word carried extra weight this night. God does not ask us to be perfect, Father O'Brien said. He asks us to be honest, to seek truth, to love mercy, to act justly. These things are possible even here, even now, even in circumstances none of us would have chosen. During the consecration, the chapel fell into profound silence. The familiar mystery unfolded as it had for centuries. Bread and wine transformed into body and blood through words spoken by a priest in an army uniform in a prison camp. Louisiana in the middle of a war that had not yet reached its conclusion. Klaus received communion. The host touched his tongue. He tasted wheat and divinity, mixed together in a way that defied rational explanation, but felt absolutely real. He returned to his seat and knelt, pressing his forehead against the rough bench in front of him, and felt tears sting his eyes. He was not sure why he was crying. Grief for everything lost, relief at finding something that persisted, gratitude for grace he did not deserve, confusion at how this American priest could offer the same mercy he would receive from a German priest. All of it mixed together until specific emotions became impossible to separate. The Mass ended. The candles were extinguished, but no one left immediately. They lingered in the chapel, reluctant to return to barracks and the reality of imprisonment. This space felt different, sacred in ways that had nothing to do with location or architecture, holy because people had gathered seeking God and found something that transcended the categories that divided them. In the months that followed Christmas, something shifted in the camp. Not dramatically, not in ways easily documented, but prisoners who attended Mass regularly began to carry themselves differently. A softening around the eyes, less tension in their shoulders, the hard edge of ideology wearing away under repeated exposure to something older and more fundamental. Klaus noticed this in himself. The propaganda's hold had weakened to the point where he could examine it critically. Americans were not savages. They were humans, some good and some bad, most just ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary circumstances. The regime's teachings about racial superiority and national destiny looked increasingly hollow when confronted with daily evidence of shared humanity. Friedrich's rosary group grew. 20 prisoners attended regularly. They prayed together in the evenings, their voices carrying across the camp, and no one stopped them. The freedom to worship openly had become normal, unremarkable. But for men who had grown accustomed to hiding their faith, this normality felt revolutionary. Father O'Brien continued his work with steady competence. He offered Mass every Sunday, confession on Saturdays, conversations whenever prisoners sought them. He never pushed, never demanded, just provided consistent presence and access to sacraments. The rest happened naturally, as faith found space to exist without political interference. In February, Klaus was transferred. Processing for eventual repatriation had begun. He would be moved to a facility in Maryland, then eventually shipped back to Germany when logistics allowed. The news brought relief and fear in equal measure. Relief because imprisonment, however benign, was still imprisonment. Fear because Germany was destroyed, occupied, and the future that was completely uncertain. Before leaving, he sought out Father O'Brien. They met in the chapel on a Tuesday afternoon. The space was empty, quiet except for rain on the tin roof. Klaus had practiced what he wanted to say, translating it into broken English with Muller's help the previous evening. Father, I want to thank you. The English was halting but comprehensible. You showed me that God is bigger than war. That faith is not about nation or politics, just about truth. Father O'Brien listened. When Klaus finished, the chaplain stood and embraced him. Not a formal handshake. A genuine hug, the kind offered to family. Klaus felt something crack in his chest, the last wall of defensive distance crumbling. Go with God, Father O'Brien said. Remember that you are loved, that God's mercy is infinite, that no matter what happens, you are his child. Klaus nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. Years later, historians would discover Friedrich's diary, preserved by his family after his death in 1987. The entries from his time at Camp Claiborne provide extraordinary insight into the psychological transformation that occurred among Catholic prisoners. December 26, 1943. Yesterday, we celebrated Christmas Mass. An American priest offered the same liturgy I have known since childhood. I cannot reconcile this with what we were told about the enemy. How can they be godless if they maintain such devotion? How can they be morally inferior if their priests preach the same gospel. January 14th, 1944. Attended confession today. First time in 3 years. Spoke in German to a priest who understood perhaps 10 words, yet I felt absolved. The sacrament transcends language. I begin to understand that it also transcends the divisions we have created. March 3rd, 1944. Klaus departed yesterday. We prayed together before he left. He told me that Father O'Brien saved his faith. I think he saved mine as well, though not in any way the regime would recognize. He saved it by showing us that it belongs to God, not to any political system. April 22nd, 1944. The Rosary group now includes 30 men. We pray each evening. American guards sometimes stop to listen. 1. A corporal named Martinez joined us tonight. He is also Catholic. We prayed together, German and American voices mixing in Latin. If someone had told me a year ago this would happen, I would have called them insane. Peter, the young prisoner who had joined Friedrich's Rosary group early, maintained correspondence with Father O'Brien after the war. The letters, preserved in the Army Chaplain Corps' archives, reveal the long-term impact of their encounter. September 1946, from Hamburg. Dear Father O'Brien, I hope this letter finds you well. I am back in Germany now, working to rebuild what was destroyed. The physical reconstruction is difficult, but possible. The spiritual reconstruction is harder. Many have lost their faith. They cannot understand how God allowed such suffering. But I remember what you taught us, that God does not cause human evil, but offers grace to those who seek it. This sustains me. December 1947. I attended Mass at our rebuilt church today. The priest is old, exhausted, still trying to understand what happened to our country. I thought about you in the chapel at Camp Claiborne, how you maintained faith through the war, how you showed us that Christianity transcends nationality. I tried to share this with others, though it is difficult to explain. June 1950. The war is 5 years past now. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, sometimes like yesterday. I am married now, starting a family. When my children ask about the war, I tell them about you, about the American priest who treated German prisoners with dignity and offered us the same Christ you offered your own soldiers. This is the lesson I want them to carry forward. In May 1944, Father O'Brien submitted his quarterly report to Army Chaplain Corps headquarters. The document, bureaucratic and formulaic, nonetheless reveals his perspective on what had occurred. Catholic services for German POWs have become a regular feature of camp life. Average attendance, 35 to 40 prisoners. Sacraments offered include Mass, confession, and occasional baptisms, 2 this quarter, for prisoners who expressed desire to formalize childhood baptisms they felt were compromised by political pressure. The impact of these services extends beyond immediate spiritual care. Prisoners who attend regularly show improved morale and cooperation with camp authorities. More significantly, they demonstrate willingness to question the ideological training they received. Many expressed that encountering American Catholics contradicted propaganda about U.S. moral inferiority. My assessment: faith-based programming for POWs serves practical and ethical purposes. Practically, it improves camp atmosphere and prisoner cooperation. Ethically, it affirms our commitment to treating prisoners as humans deserving of dignity, including spiritual dignity. It also undermines enemy ideology more effectively than any explicit counter-propaganda could. Recommendation: continue and expand Catholic services at POW facilities. Provide additional resources, liturgical materials, rosaries, devotional literature in German. Consider similar programming for Protestant prisoners, though their needs may differ given denominational diversity. The report was filed, approved, and sent to other camps as a model for prisoner religious programming. Father O'Brien's work became a template replicated across dozens of facilities. touching thousands of prisoners who had returned to Germany carrying memories of American chaplains who offered them Christ without conditions. Klaus arrived back in Germany in July 1945. The war had ended 2 months earlier. The country he returned to bore little resemblance to the one he had left. Cities were rubble, the economy destroyed, the political system completely transformed under occupation. Millions displaced, hungry, traumatized by years of bombing and defeat. He made his way to Bavaria, to the village where his mother still lived in a house that had somehow survived intact. She was older, thinner, marked by years of worry and privation, but alive. They embraced in the doorway, and Klaus felt the full weight of everything that had happened crash down on him. Over the following days, he told her about the camp, about Louisiana heat and pine forests, about adequate food and reasonable treatment, and about Father O'Brien, about Mass in the chapel, about Christmas Eve singing carols in Latin with American soldiers, about confession that had cracked open something he thought war had sealed permanently. His mother listened with tears in her eyes. "I prayed you would not lose your faith," she said quietly. "That was my greatest fear. Not that you would die, though I feared that too, but that you would lose your soul." Klaus nodded. He had come close, closer than he wanted to admit. But Father O'Brien had held open a door he had been ready to close forever. The American priest had shown him that faith was larger than politics, that God's mercy extended beyond national boundaries, that the gospel was not German or American, but universal. He began attending the village church again. It was damaged, but functional. The old priest who had baptized him 40 years earlier still served, bent and tired, but still offering Mass. Klaus joined the congregation, prayed, received communion, slowly rebuilt a spiritual life that war had nearly destroyed. Friedrich returned to his family's farm in Thuringia, now part of the Soviet occupation zone. The political situation there was different, more tightly controlled. Religious practice was viewed with suspicion. The regime had changed, but the suspicion of faith continued under different ideology. Still, Friedrich maintained his devotion. He attended Mass when possible, prayed the rosary daily, and he began quietly sharing what he had learned in Louisiana with neighbors, with other veterans, with anyone who would listen. "I was imprisoned by Americans," he would say. "They treated us with dignity, fed us adequately, and they allowed us to practice our faith without interference. Their priests offered the same sacraments as ours, preached the same gospel. I learned that Christianity is not about nation or politics. It is about truth." This message was dangerous in occupied Germany. It contradicted both the fallen regime's propaganda and the new occupying power's political needs. But Friedrich persisted, quietly, carefully, planting seeds that would grow slowly over decades. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified, an elderly man named Peter attended a special Mass at his church in Hamburg. The priest mentioned that a visiting American chaplain would be consecrating. The visiting priest was introduced as Father Michael O'Brien. Peter's heart stopped. It could not be. 45 years had passed. Father O'Brien would be in his 80s now. But the name was distinctive enough that Peter approached after Mass, moving slowly through the crowd with his cane. "Father O'Brien?" The old priest turned. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were the same, alert, kind, present. "Yes?" "Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, 1943. Recognition dawned slowly across Father O'Brien's face. "You were there?" Peter nodded. "I prayed the rosary with Friedrich. Attended your Christmas Mass. You gave me confession when I had not confessed in years." They embraced. Two old men, once enemy and captor, now just brothers in faith who had shared a moment of grace during humanity's darkest hour. They talked for an hour, remembered, shared what had happened in the intervening decades, marveled at the strange path that had brought them to this reunion. "Did you know?" Peter asked. "Did you know what impact you would have?" Father O'Brien shook his head. "I just offered Mass, heard confessions, did my job. The rest was grace." "It was more than that," Peter insisted. "You showed us that God was bigger than our war, that faith transcended the divisions we had created, that Christ's mercy extended even to us." Father O'Brien's eyes grew wet. "That was never in question. Christ's mercy extends to everyone. I just provided access to sacraments. God did the rest." Years later, after both men had died, historians would study the peculiar phenomenon of German Posen encountering American Catholic chaplains. They would analyze reports, read diaries, interview survivors. They would try to quantify the impact, measure the transformation, explain in academic language what had occurred in those camps. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any analysis could capture. Men who had been taught that their enemies were godless discovered priests who offered the same Christ. Prisoners who expected punishment found grace instead. Soldiers raised on propaganda encountered reality that contradicted every certainty they had been given. And slowly, through small moments that accumulated over months, their worldview transformed, not through argument, not through counter-propaganda, just through consistent exposure to faith practiced without political contamination, to liturgy that transcended national boundaries, to mercy offered freely to all who sought it. Father O'Brien had not set out to change hearts. He had simply done his job, offered Mass, heard confessions, provided pastoral care to all who needed it, regardless of which uniform they wore. But in doing so, he had accomplished what no military strategy could achieve. He had shown enemy soldiers that Americans were capable of faith, morality, and genuine Christianity. This destroyed the regime's propaganda more effectively than any battlefield victory. Because once you have prayed beside your enemy, once you have received communion from his priest, once you have knelt in his chapel and experienced God's presence there, you cannot maintain the fiction that he is fundamentally different from you. Louisiana, 1943. Rain on the tin roof. Latin prayers rising in the humid air. German and American voices mixed in worship. And the slow, steady work of grace, dismantling hatred one Mass at a time. The war would end. The camps would close. The prisoners would return to shattered homes and uncertain futures. But they carried something with them that no bombing could destroy. The memory of an American priest who treated them with dignity, who offered them Christ without conditions, who showed them that faith was larger than any human conflict. And in kitchens and churches and quiet conversations across Germany, in the decades that followed, some would remember, would tell their children and grandchildren about the chapel at Camp Claiborne, about Father O'Brien, about discovering that God's mercy knew no national boundaries. It was a small thing, really. A few dozen prisoners attending Mass in a temporary chapel in a temporary camp during a war that seemed to consume the whole world. But small things, done with love and consistency, can transform hearts that grand gestures never touch. The propaganda promised that America was godless. Father O'Brien proved otherwise, not through argument, not through preaching, just through being himself. A priest, a soldier, a man who believed that everyone, even the enemy, deserved access to grace. And that made all the difference.